The flashing blue and red lights felt like a spotlight shining down on me as I stood in my own driveway. "Step away from the car," the officer said, his hand near his holster, clearly uncomfortable with the situation.
You need to move your vehicle
I glanced down at
immediately.
my socks, pepperoni pizzas, and then at Tara, standing across the street with her phone aimed at me like a camera from a reality show. "He's blocking the street," Tara shrieked, pointing at me with a manicured finger. "He's causing a disturbance.
You need to get off my property
He's
before
hogging
I
the
make
road."
you.
I shook my head, incredulous.
You need to move that right now.
"I'm literally parked in front of my own
It is
house,"
on my
I said,
property.
holding
Get
up
off
my
my
cold
lawn.
coffee mug like it was a weapon. "Officer, he's
You are in
loitering,"
direct
Tara yelled.
violation of the
"I've seen him do
guidelines.
this
No.
every day. He's watching us.
This is
He's
my
a
house
threat."
and
The
my
officer looked at
driveway.
me, then back
I
at
have
her.
a right to be here.
"Sir, do you live here?" "Yes, I own this house," I replied, gesturing toward the driveway. "I pay the taxes. I maintain it. This is my property." But Tara wasn't done. She just smirked. "This is only the beginning," she muttered, and I knew in that moment she wasn't just going after my parking space. Tara Miller wasn't just the HOA president, she was the self-appointed queen of Oak Creek. The moment she moved in, she started making changes, some small, some outrageous, all with the same goal: control. No one in this neighborhood was exempt from her gaze. Whether it was the color of your mailbox, the height of your hedges, or the way you parked your car, Tara had an opinion on it. She was a force of nature, and not the kind you wanted to get caught in. Her floral print tracksuit was a walking contradiction, loud, bold, and yet somehow still managing to look like she had control over everything around her. If the neighborhood were a board game, Tara was the one holding all the pieces and moving them according to her whims. Her latest target, me. My crime was parking my car in front of my house. Somehow, this trivial action had become a personal affront to her sense of order. It didn't matter that I wasn't blocking anyone's driveway. It didn't matter that my car had been parked there for months without incident. To Tara, it was a violation, a disruption of the peace. And in her world, peace didn't mean tranquility. It meant conformity. Every interaction with Tara felt like a lesson in power dynamics. She used the HOA's rules like a weapon, twisting every little clause to fit her narrative. "You can't park here," she'd say, with that smug smile. "It's a violation of neighborhood harmony." Her voice always had that patronizing tone, like she was doing you a favor by explaining the rules. But it wasn't just about the parking. Oh no, that was just the beginning. She had a network neighbors who feared her and complained behind closed doors. Little by little, she had built an army of followers who saw her as the unquestioned authority. If she told them to report you for something as insignificant as the color of your front door, they would. The fear of her wasn't just because of her position. It was because she made sure you knew that stepping out of line, no matter how small, would come with consequences. For Tara, being in charge was everything. And she wasn't about to let me, someone she saw as a threat to her control, get away with something as simple as parking in front of my house. She would make sure I knew that my small rebellion was her opportunity to flex her power. And as I stood there, my coffee mug still in hand, I couldn't help but feel that this was more than just a neighbor dispute. It was a war for my right to simply exist, to live peacefully in my own home, without someone like her constantly hovering over every decision I made. Tara's game had started, and I was already caught in the middle. The first time I received an HOA violation letter, I thought it was a mistake. I had only been living in Oak Creek for a few months, and I hadn't even unpacked all my boxes yet. But there it was, lying on my doorstep one bright Saturday morning. It wasn't just a letter. It was a formal notice, violation of parking regulations, blockage of street, section 3.4. The letter was crisp, official-looking, and absurd. I stared at it, my first reaction, disbelief. I wasn't blocking anyone's driveway. I wasn't blocking the flow of traffic. My car was parked in front of my house. But that didn't matter to Tara Miller. She had deemed it a violation, and once she set her sights on something, she wouldn't let it go. A few days later, I saw her in her usual spot, standing at her window, eyes fixed on the street like some kind of neighborhood watchhawk. She wasn't alone. A few of her helpers, the old retirees who lived nearby and were more than willing to do Tara's bidding, had gathered by the fence across the street watching me like I was a criminal. I didn't need to look twice to know they were talking about me. I'd learned that Tara didn't just control the HOA. She controlled everything in Oak Creek. If you trimmed your hedges too much, Tara would be the first to point out the violation. If you left your garbage can out past 6 p.m., you'd get a letter from the HOA within the week. It was her way or the highway, and that highway always led back to her front door. But this parking thing, it was just the beginning. A week later, I was sitting on my porch enjoying the last few sips of my coffee when I saw Tara's car parked across the street. She wasn't just parked, she was sitting in it staring at me through her windshield like a hawk, waiting for its prey. Her sunglasses were perched on the tip of her nose, and she had that smug look on her face the same look she had when she'd made all those passive-aggressive comments about the way I painted my front door. I ignored her. The last thing I wanted was to escalate things with her, but I could feel her eyes on me even through the tinted windows. And then, just as I thought she might finally leave me alone, her phone rang. She put the car in gear, and I could hear her shout, "I'm going to call the police. He's blocking the street again. I'm not going to let him get away with this." I stood up, shaking my head in disbelief. This wasn't happening. Not over parking, not over something this ridiculous, but it was happening. About 10 minutes later, I heard the distant hum of a police car approaching. I looked out from behind the curtain of my window, and sure enough, a squad car was pulling up to the curb in front of my house. Tara's car was still there, parked across the street, as she filmed me from behind her steering wheel. The officer, Officer Miller, stepped out of the car, looking around like he had just arrived at the scene of a crime. He looked at the empty street and then at me. The tension in the air was palpable. "Sir, are you the owner of this vehicle?" he asked, his voice flat. I nodded, confused and frustrated. "Yes, officer. That's my car parked right in front of my house." "I see," he said. "We've received a complaint. Neighbors are saying you're blocking the street." "Blocking the street," I echoed incredulously. "Officer, there's no one even driving on this street. It's a quiet residential area." "I understand, sir," Officer Miller said, clearly uncomfortable. "But when there's a complaint, we have to respond." I couldn't believe it. This was really happening. Tara was now standing on her front porch filming us, her phone held out at arm's length like she was trying to capture some kind of cinematic moment. I heard her yell, "See, he's doing it again. He's defying the rules. He doesn't care about the neighborhood. He thinks he's above everyone." I turned to look at Officer Miller. "I'm literally parking in front of my house," I said, trying to keep calm. "I've lived here for 3 months, and not once have I blocked anyone. This is my property. I pay the taxes. I maintain it. I'm not breaking any laws." Officer Miller sighed, looking like he was about to say something, but didn't know where to begin. He scratched his head and glanced at Tara's house across the street. "Sir, the complaint's been made. The rules are the rules." Tara's voice cut through the air like a blade. "He's disturbing the peace. We can't let him park here anymore. He's making the neighborhood unsafe." I felt the blood rush to my face. Unsafe? I wasn't even doing anything. How is this even legal? Officer Miller sighed again, a deep, exhausted sigh that told me all I needed to know. He was caught in the middle of something ridiculous, but he had to follow through. He turned to me and said, "For now, let's just avoid further confrontation. Move the car off the street." I stared at him, shocked. "I'm not moving my car. I'm not breaking any laws. I'll happily fight this in court, but I'm not going to give in to her. I've got a mortgage to pay. This is my home." He hesitated, then looked back at Tara, who was still filming, her face twisted in a smug smile. "Look, I'll let you off with a warning, but just keep it down. Don't make things harder than they need to be, okay?" I looked at him, frustrated but resigned. Fine. But as I stood there, I could feel Tara's eyes boring into me. She had the upper hand again. This wasn't about parking. It was about control. She wanted to run this neighborhood, and I wasn't about to let her. The war had just begun. A few days after the parking incident, the first official notice from the HOA arrived. It was not a violation for blocking the street anymore. No, this time they had found something new to complain about. Violation of neighborhood harmony. Parking in front of your property disrupts the aesthetic flow of the street, the letter said in that same crisp, formal language. Designed to make you feel guilty, even if you hadn't done anything wrong. I stared at it, trying to process. This wasn't just about parking anymore. It was about me being too visible, about me being a disruption in the perfect, controlled suburban neighborhood she thought she could own. My parking, my simple act of existing in front of my own house, had somehow become a threat to the aesthetic flow of the neighborhood. I should have expected it, but I was still furious. Tara wasn't going to stop, and she wasn't just going after my parking anymore. She was making her move to take control of the entire street. I sent an email to the HOA board explaining my side and asking for clarification. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they'd realize this was absurd. But the next day, the HOA sent an inspector. His name was Stanley, and when I answered the door, he looked like a man who didn't want to be there. He was wearing a beige button-up shirt that had HOA inspector embroidered on it, and a pair of khaki pants that had definitely seen better days. "Mr. Bennett, I'm here to do an inspection of your property," Stanley said, shuffling his feet like he had somewhere better to be. The HOA's request. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or yell. "So now, you're sending someone to inspect my house because I parked in front of it. That's really what we're doing now," Stanley sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Look, I don't make the rules, man. I'm just here to do my job." I nodded, trying to stay calm. "Fine. inspect away. Stanley walked around my property, tapping a clipboard against his leg and scribbling things down. I watched him standing there on my porch, wondering how long this nonsense would continue. Everything seems in order though, right? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. I'm not really sure what you're inspecting, given that I've already been through this with the officer. Stanley paused for a moment, then gave me an apologetic look. We're following up on complaints, Mr. Bennett. I'm just doing what I've been asked to do. The tension was building, but it wasn't even about the inspection anymore. It was about Tara's grip on this community and how she was using the HOA as a weapon. She wasn't going to stop until she made sure I knew my place. By the time Stanley left, I felt more exhausted than ever. He had inspected the lawn, taken pictures of the street, and even checked my mailbox for some reason. It felt like I was being treated like a criminal for simply existing in a space that was supposed to be mine. The next week, another letter arrived, and this time it was official. The HOA was imposing a fine of $500 for disturbing the neighborhood's aesthetic. There was no explanation, no legal backing for why my parking my car was disrupting anything. Just a fine. Tara had made sure of it. It was becoming clear to me now, this was no longer just about parking. It was about Tara making an example of me. She had turned a small inconvenience into a full-scale war, and she was using the power of the HOA to wage it. But that wasn't the end of it. I was getting frustrated. I started paying attention to what she was doing, watching her house from my window. I'd see her moving around, always looking for the next thing to complain about. It wasn't just my parking anymore. It was everything. One day, I caught her in the act. She was standing outside her house, staring across the street at me. I knew what she was doing. She was watching me, watching every move I made, looking for the next thing to report. Her eyes flicked over to the yard next door, then back to me. And I knew deep down that this was going to get worse before it got better. So I started doing my own research. I spent hours looking into Tara's past, searching for any dirt I could find. There had to be something, anything to explain her obsession with controlling the neighborhood. I even went so far as to look up the town's records, hoping to find something to prove that she was abusing her position. But all I found was more frustration. Tara's history was spotless on paper. She had no criminal background, no violations on record. It looked like she had been playing this game for years, making small complaints, slowly building a case against anyone she saw as a problem. That's when I started digging into the HOA's legal framework. I had to understand how far she could go, what I was really up against. That's when I discovered the flaw in her plan. There was one piece of the HOA's authority, that she didn't control the community vote. I'd always thought of the HOA as a single entity, a unified body that made all the decisions for the neighborhood. But in reality, it was the residents who had the power to vote on key issues, decisions that Tara couldn't force on us without our consent. Tara had the power to make complaints, but she didn't have the final say. That gave me a plan, a way to fight back. I wasn't going to let her turn me into a target, but I needed to outsmart her first. I started gathering evidence, documenting everything, every conversation, every letter, every complaint. I needed a plan to not just defend myself, but to take down her entire reign. I had underestimated just how deep this went. It wasn't just Tara being a petty neighbor, this was personal. The more I looked into her actions, the more I realized that everything she was doing, from the HOA complaints to the constant surveillance, had a hidden motive. She wasn't just targeting me because of my parking or my disruptive behavior. There was something far darker at play here. I wasn't the first person to be on the receiving end of Tara's obsession with control. As I dug through the HOA's records, I found other cases where Tara had driven residents to their breaking points. People who had tried to challenge her, tried to fight back, had either left or been forced into compliance. And it became clear to me that Tara wasn't just trying to maintain order. She was trying to break people. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was a tyrant hiding behind bylaws and fake smiles. But that wasn't all I uncovered. The more I researched, the more I began to see a connection between Tara's personal history and her tyrannical behavior. Her childhood, as it turned out, hadn't been as perfect as she made it seem. I went back into the local records and dug up more personal files on Tara. It wasn't easy, but a couple of phone calls to the right people helped me get the information I needed. Tara had grown up in this very neighborhood, but things had been different back then. Her family had struggled financially, and Tara's father had been a very vocal figure in the community. A man who always thought he deserved more than he got. I found a couple of court documents from the early 92nds where Tara's family had been involved in a property dispute with a neighbor. That neighbor, my father. The connection hit me like a freight train. Tara's family had lost a major lawsuit against my father years ago over a piece of land that had been rightfully his. The case had been settled, and Tara's family had walked away with nothing. But that loss had festered, and I realized now that Tara had spent the last 20 years nursing this grudge, blaming my family for her failure. This wasn't just about parking. This wasn't about some minor infraction that had gotten out of hand. This was about revenge. Tara had been trying to reclaim what she felt she was owed, and I had become the target simply because my family had won that legal battle. She was using her position as HOA president to get back at us, using the rules as a weapon to drive me and my family out of the neighborhood she saw as hers. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Tara had never let go of that loss. She couldn't stand the idea of anyone winning over her. And now, with the power of the HOA behind her, she was determined to right the wrongs she had never fully come to terms with. She'd spent all these years building a network of loyal neighbors who were too afraid to question her authority. Anyone who stood up to her got crushed under the weight of her control. I knew I couldn't just fight her using conventional methods. I needed to make her crack. I needed to expose her for what she was, someone who wasn't just abusing her power, but someone who had a deep personal vendetta, one that went all the way back to the roots of this neighborhood. I started gathering evidence of her past actions. I spoke to neighbors who had lived here long before Tara took control. They told me stories of how she'd tried to manipulate them into compliance, how she'd once turned the entire block against a family because their garden was too wild for her tastes. Her vendetta had always been hidden beneath layers of rules and regulations, but the more I pieced it together, the clearer her true motives became. The tipping point came when I spoke to Linda Harris, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She had seen Tara grow up, and she knew all the stories. "She's been like this her whole life," Linda told me, shaking her head. "She always wanted control, always thought she deserved more. But her father, well, he couldn't handle the defeat, and neither could she. They lost that case, and she never forgave your family for it." That was all I needed to hear. I now had the key to everything: Tara's personal history, her hatred for my family, and the emotional fuel that had been driving her actions for years. I realized this wasn't just about fighting an HOA president. It was about exposing the long-buried truth behind her power trip. I had to use her own weapon against her, the HOA's rules. But this time, I wasn't going to just play by her rules. I was going to expose her not just as a petty neighbor, but as someone who had used the system for years to manipulate and control everyone around her, all because of a personal vendetta. I wasn't going to let Tara destroy my life. Not when I had the upper hand now. The moment I realized that I could use the legal framework against Tara, everything changed. I had spent weeks gathering information, talking to neighbors, and piecing together her history of overreach, manipulation, and revenge. Now it was time to bring that information into the light. But I needed leverage, something concrete that would force her to face the consequences of her actions. I decided to start with the HOA board, the very entity that had been enabling her for all these years. I drafted a letter carefully, outlining Tara's abuses, her personal vendetta, and her abuse of power as the HOA president. I detailed her manipulation of neighbors, her repeated use of false complaints, and how she had weaponized the HOA's regulations to punish anyone who dared to challenge her authority. I included copies of my own violation notices and the endless complaints she had filed against me. The letter wasn't just a complaint, it was a formal accusation. It was my way of saying, "I know what you've been doing, and it's time for you to answer for it." I was nervous, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I couldn't let her run roughshod over me, and I couldn't let her get away with this anymore. So I sent the letter to the board members and also filed a complaint with the local authorities about Tara's personal vendetta and the way she had been abusing the HOA's powers. A few days later, I received a response from the HOA board. They had scheduled a formal meeting to review the complaints. Tara wasn't mentioned by name, but I knew she was the driving force behind the board's decision to review the case. She was the puppet master, and I was about to expose the strings. The meeting was set for that Thursday evening. I showed up armed with all the evidence I had gathered. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I had a feeling this would be the turning point. The board members were sitting around a large conference table in a dimly lit room, their expressions tight with discomfort. Tara was at the head of the table, of course, wearing that confident smile of hers, the one that had carried her through years of getting whatever she wanted. But this time, something was different. I wasn't the only one who had complaints. As I sat in the back of the room quietly observing, I noticed that several other neighbors were present, including Linda Harris, who had shared her insights about Tara's history with me. The first person to speak was Greg Thompson, a neighbor who lived 2 doors down from me. Greg wasn't known for being outspoken, but tonight he wasn't holding back. "I'm here tonight because I can't take it anymore," Greg said, his voice steady but filled with frustration. "Tara's been running this neighborhood like it's her personal fiefdom. My family's been receiving fines for everything. First it was for trimming the hedges too much, then for leaving our trash can out too long. Every single thing we do is criticized. I could see Tara's expression falter for a moment. Her eyes flicked to Greg, and she leaned forward ready to brush off his complaint with some form of bureaucratic explanation, but he wasn't done. I've talked to the other neighbors, Greg continued, and I'm not the only one. Tara's been using the HOA to harass people who don't fall in line. I've had enough of it. The room fell silent. Tara's face turned red, but she remained seated, her jaw clenched tightly. I could see the tension building, and I knew this was just the beginning. One by one, other neighbors began to speak up. Missus Higgins, who had lived here longer than most, stood next. I've had complaints filed against me for nothing. I once had my flowers trimmed back too much. Tara didn't like it, so she fined me. She's made me feel like I'm not even allowed to have a garden, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. And it's not just me. I've seen how she manipulates everyone around her. I've seen it for years. We've all been too scared to say anything, but this has gone too far. I could feel the power shifting in the room. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this fight. The room grew quieter as Linda Harris stood up. She wasn't known for getting involved in neighborhood politics, but she had been one of Tara's first victims. Linda had been with the neighborhood when Tara's family lost that lawsuit, and now she was taking the opportunity to expose Tara for what she truly was. I've lived here for over 40 years. Linda began, her voice firm, and I've never seen anyone as controlling as Tara. I've seen what she's done to people. She's never gotten over the lawsuit with the Bennett family. She's been using the HOA to get back at them ever since. The room went silent, every head turning to Tara. Her face went pale, and her eyes darted nervously. She knew the truth was out now. The personal vendetta she had been hiding was no longer a secret. "Tara, is this true?" one of the board members, a woman named Karen Winters, asked. The tone was polite, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "Have you been using your position to target specific residents? Have you been abusing the HOA's power for personal reasons?" Tara's expression hardened, but she didn't deny it. She shifted in her chair, visibly uncomfortable. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly, but the words sounded rehearsed. "I've always acted in the best interest of the neighborhood, but no one was buying it." I could see the board members exchanging glances, their confidence in Tara starting to waver. They knew now that this wasn't about maintaining order, it was about control, about revenge. The HOA had been her weapon, and she had used it to hurt people for years. As I sat there, I realized this meeting was my chance. It wasn't just about parking or complaints anymore. It was about Tara's abuse of power, and I had the proof. The authorities were starting to look at her actions more closely, and for the first time, she was the one in the hot seat. I waited for the moment to strike, knowing that everything was about to change. The tension in the room had reached its peak by the time the HOA board members finished their quiet deliberation. Tara's past manipulations and her personal vendetta against my family were no longer whispers among the residents. They had been brought to light, and Tara had no way to spin her way out of this one. The board, visibly shaken, glanced between each other, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. I was ready to make my move. "I think it's clear now," I said, standing up from my chair and addressing the room. The moment I spoke, the room fell silent. I wasn't about to let Tara talk her way out of this one. I had waited far too long for this. I've presented all the facts. The complaints, the fines, the harassment. I continued, pausing for a moment to ensure everyone was paying attention. Tara has used her position to target me, to punish me for something that happened decades ago, something completely unrelated to anything she's trying to justify now. And she's done this to other residents too. It's not just me. I turned to face Tara, my eyes hardening. I wanted her to feel every ounce of the weight I had carried for months. "You've used the HOA as your personal tool of revenge. You've manipulated the rules to serve your vendetta against my family for winning a legal battle your father lost. And now you're trying to make everyone in this room believe that this is about parking, about aesthetics, about nothing at all." Tara's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "That's not true," she snapped, her voice shaky but fierce. "I've only ever done what's best for this community, what's best for everyone here." I shook my head slowly. "No, Tara. What's best for you is using the HOA to enforce your control over others. You've turned people's personal lives into your battleground. You've torn this community apart, and for what? Because of a loss your family suffered years ago, you've been tormenting innocent people in your pursuit of power." Her face tightened. She had no retort, no explanation, and the board members could see that. She had no leg to stand on. Before Tara could respond, Linda Harris, the very same woman who had been silenced for so many years, spoke up. I can't stay silent anymore, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I've lived here a long time, and I've seen it. I've seen how Tara runs this HOA like a dictatorship, and I've seen how she manipulates the people around her to get what she wants. She never lets go of her grudges. Her words were like the final push over the edge. The dam had broken. Other neighbors who had been hesitant to speak up for fear of Tara's wrath began sharing their stories. People I barely knew started recounting how Tara had threatened them with fines, how she had pressured them into compliance, how she had used the HOA's power to hurt them. One neighbor, Janet, stood up and told the board about the times Tara had reported her for having flowers that didn't fit the neighborhood's aesthetic, even though her garden had been there for over 20 years. By the time the room fell silent again, Tara was no longer the confident, untouchable figure she had once been. She was just another manipulative HOA president who had overstayed her welcome. The board members once loyal to her were now clearly divided. The power was slipping from her fingers. I looked at the members of the HOA board. I've shown you the facts. I've shown you how Tara has used this board as her personal weapon. She doesn't care about rules, regulations, or even the neighborhood. She only cares about control, and she's abused it for far too long. It's time for this to end. A few of the members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. They knew it was true. This was no longer just a personal dispute. This was about a power dynamic that had been quietly eating away at the fabric of the neighborhood. The tension was palpable, the moment hanging in the air like a sword. I could feel Tara's eyes on me, full of anger, disbelief, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of fear. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and I was not backing down. The board president, Karen Winters, cleared her throat. She had been quiet during most of the meeting, but now she spoke up. This is a serious matter. We'll need to vote. We cannot let something like this go unchecked. I nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. It was finally happening. The end of Tara's reign was within reach. I wasn't going to let her bully me or anyone else in this neighborhood ever again. As the board members began to discuss the matter quietly among themselves, Tara looked at me, her face twisted with frustration. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. If you want to continue to fight this, Tara, I said calmly, you're going to have to face the consequences. This isn't just a matter of fines or complaints. You've targeted people for years, and you can't run from this anymore. Her eyes flashed with anger, but she said nothing. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. I had her cornered, and there was no escape. The game was over. It was clear now that Tara's time in power was over. The question was no longer if she would be removed, but when. And I was going to make sure it happened. By the time the vote started, the room was thick with tension. Every word that was spoken seemed to echo in the silence, and I could feel Tara's glare burning into the back of my head. Her facade was cracking, her carefully built control over the neighborhood, slipping through her fingers. She had always been the one who made the rules, who dictated the lives of the people in this neighborhood. But now, the tables had turned. The board members who had once been her loyal followers were now looking at her with doubt. It was clear they were starting to question her authority. Let's get this over with, Karen Winters, the board president said, her voice cutting through the air. We need to vote on whether we'll take action regarding the complaints and the allegations of misuse of power. The board members all nodded, some of them exchanging uncomfortable glances. Tara, her face flushed with anger, opened her mouth to speak but was immediately cut off by Karen. Tara, please. We've heard your side. Now it's time for the vote. Tara stiffened, but she didn't argue. She knew it was over. She had run out of excuses, and there was no one left in the room who was buying her narrative. The power was slipping away, and she had nowhere to hide. I sat back, crossing my arms, and watching as the board members deliberated. My heart pounded in my chest, the anticipation of what was about to happen weighing heavily on me. This was the moment of truth. This was the moment when Tara's reign of terror would come to an end. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, Karen looked at me and then turned to the board. We'll take a show of hands. Those in favor of removing Tara from her position as HOA president and addressing the complaints raised by Mr. Bennett. One by one, the hands went up. At first there was hesitation, but as more members voted in favor of removing Tara, the weight of the decision seemed to shift in my favor. Tara's face drained of color as she realized what was happening. Her control, her grip on this neighborhood, was slipping faster than she could hold on to it. But there was one more thing I had planned. I wasn't just going to let Tara be removed quietly. I wasn't going to let her off the hook with a simple vote. She had made my life miserable, used the HOA to harass me, and nearly driven me out of my own home. I wasn't going to let her escape with just a slap on the wrist. As the final votes were cast, I stood up, forcing the room to pay attention. Before you make your final decision, I said, my voice loud and clear, I have one more piece of evidence to share. One final thing that I think the community needs to know. Tara's eyes widened in panic. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I held up the folder that had been sitting on the table in front of me. The evidence I had gathered, the personal vendetta, the years of manipulation, the HOA abuse, the lies. This isn't just about parking. This isn't just about violations. This is about a person who has used her position of power to harass, intimidate, and destroy the lives of anyone she sees as a threat. This is about someone who uses the rules to break people to get what she wants. I turned the folder around, showing the board members the evidence inside. I showed them the detailed records I had uncovered about Tara's past, about how she had once used the HOA to crush a family just like mine, just because she couldn't let go of a grudge. The stories, the complaints, the documentation of everything she had done to me and the others were all laid out in front of them. Tara didn't say a word. She couldn't. She was paralyzed, staring at the papers, her eyes wide with disbelief. She thought she could control the room, but the truth had caught up with her. I could feel the room shifting. The board members were no longer looking at me like the problem. They were looking at Tara with suspicion, disappointment, and even anger. This isn't about some petty dispute, I continued, my voice steady. This is about someone abusing their power. This is about a person who was never satisfied with winning once. She needed to win forever. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was waiting for Tara's reaction, but she had nothing left. The veil of control she had so carefully built around herself had collapsed, and now she was exposed for what she really was, a woman who had used her position to get back at people for personal reasons. Finally, Karen Winters spoke, her voice softer, now more measured. Tara, do you have anything to say? You've heard the accusations, the evidence. Do you want to defend yourself? Tara looked like she was about to speak, but the words didn't come. She swallowed hard and glanced at the board members, who were all now staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. Tara stammered, her voice shaky. This is a misunderstanding. I've been doing my job. I'm just trying to protect the neighborhood to make sure everything stays in order. There's no vendetta. But it was too late. Her voice lacked the authority it once had. Her excuses sounded hollow, desperate. She was cornered, and there was no way out. Karen looked at the board and then at Tara. The vote is clear. You're relieved of your duties as HOA president, effective immediately. I felt a rush of relief wash over me. The fight was over. Tara's reign was over. And it wasn't just a small victory, it was a reclaiming of everything she had tried to take from me. The control, the fear, the manipulation, it was all gone. As Tara sat there defeated, the board members began to stand up one by one. They had done the right thing. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't under the thumb of one person. The neighborhood could finally breathe. The HOA meeting had devolved into complete chaos. Tara sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of forced composure. She had tried to keep the narrative in her favor as always, but now the truth was out. The community was no longer on her side. My heart pounded as I stood up, stepping into the spotlight. This wasn't just a battle about parking. It was about everything Tara had done to manipulate and control this neighborhood for years. Now the moment had come. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady but filled with purpose. This is the moment where we expose the truth for everyone to see. Tara didn't just break the rules, she weaponized them. I let the words sink in as I scanned the room. The board members were already shifting uncomfortably, clearly shaken by everything that had been revealed. Some of the neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out until now were looking at me with newfound respect. You've all seen the evidence, I continued, my eyes locking onto Tara. You've heard from multiple people who have been subjected to her cruelty. For years, she's been using the HOA as her personal tool for power and revenge. And now, the truth can no longer be ignored. Tara's jaw clenched, her hands, gripping the edge of the table, but she didn't say a word. The moment of truth had arrived, and she was cornered. I don't want anyone here to think that this is just about one neighbor, I said, my voice growing stronger. It's not just me. Tara has used her position to hurt everyone who didn't fall in line with her personal rules. And she used us to get ahead, all for the sake of control. I turned to the board members who were now looking at each other in disbelief. I wasn't backing down, and I wasn't going to let them either. We've all seen it, I continued. How she tries to break people down, how she uses every opportunity to assert her dominance. The parking fine wasn't just about parking. It was a statement. It was one more way she tried to tell me that she owned this street, this neighborhood. I glanced at the neighbors who had shown up to back me up. They were nodding along, some whispering their agreement. The weight of the moment was clear. This wasn't just a personal issue anymore. It was a community-wide problem. She's been doing this for years, I said, and now that the truth is out, there's no going back. Tara has manipulated you all for far too long. She's used the HOA to control your lives. She's used it to enforce her own personal agenda, and I've had enough. Tara's face was pale now, her usual bravado slipping away. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. I knew what she was going to say, more denials, more lies, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. I took a step forward, leaning against the table for emphasis. Tara, you're not just the HOA president. You're the queen of a house of cards you built with lies. And now it's falling apart. The only thing you're in control of now is the mess you've made. The room was silent. The board members were looking at Tara with a mixture of disbelief and pity. They had seen her as an authority figure, someone they trusted, but now they were beginning to realize just how far she had pushed the boundaries. She was no longer the respected leader of the HOA. She was just a woman caught in a web of her own making. But Tara wasn't ready to give up. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You're all being manipulated. You don't know the whole story. You don't know the truth." I shook my head slowly. "No, Tara, you don't know the truth. You've spent so many years playing the victim, pretending that everything is someone else's fault. But the truth is, you've been using your position to control people, to break them down. And now the people you've tried to hurt are standing up." She recoiled as if I had slapped her, her face twisted in anger, but there was something else there too, fear. The fear that she knew this was it. She had no more lies to tell, no more manipulation to use. The truth had caught up with her. The board members looked at each other clearly, unsure of how to handle this confrontation. They had always followed Tara's lead, but now they were being forced to confront the reality of what had been happening behind closed doors. "We can't ignore this any longer," I said, my voice firm. "Tara has been using her position to intimidate, to silence, and to punish people who didn't fall in line. But I'm not afraid anymore. I'm standing up, and I'm not the only one. There are people in this room who've had enough, and it's time for us to take our neighborhood back." Tara opened her mouth to speak, but her words were drowned out by the collective murmur of agreement from the room. The neighbors who had stayed silent for so long were now speaking up, their voices growing stronger as they rallied behind me. Tara had lost control. I could see it in her eyes. The realization that the foundation of power she had so carefully constructed was now crumbling. She was no longer the figurehead of the HOA. She was a woman backed into a corner, trying to keep the illusion of control alive. I turned to the board members. "It's time for you to decide. Do you want to keep a woman in power who has used her position to hurt the people who trusted her? Or will you stand with the community and do what's right?" The silence in the room was thick. The board members exchanged looks, and for the first time I saw doubt in their eyes. They were starting to realize they had been complicit in Tara's manipulation. They were starting to see that they had been part of the problem all along. The room was still. Everyone's eyes were on me as I held the final piece of the puzzle in my hand. The dossier. The evidence. The irrefutable proof of Tara's abuse of power. I could feel the weight of it in my grip. Everything I had worked for, everything I had fought for, was about to come crashing down on her. I turned to Tara, who stood there, frozen, her mouth open but no words escaping. For the first time, she was the one being exposed. She had always been the one with the power to control, to manipulate, but now it was her turn to face the consequences. "Here it is," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. I held up the file for everyone to see. "This is the truth. This is what Tara has been hiding from all of you." I took a deep breath and began to flip through the pages, letting the documents speak for themselves. I started with the complaints. Tara had been sending out letters to every homeowner she thought was a threat, including me. She had fabricated violations, twisted the rules to suit her needs, and threatened neighbors with fines and penalties for imaginary offenses. "This is the first letter," I said, pointing to a document. Tara claimed I was blocking the street. But as you can see, this was my driveway, my own property. I flipped to the next page, revealing a screenshot of her email to the board. And here she is, using her position to escalate things. She called the police on me again, just because I parked in front of my house. The room gasped. The board members' faces were a mix of shock and disgust. The weight of Tara's manipulations was starting to settle in. I continued flipping through more pages, exposing more lies. I held up a photocopy of her report where she had claimed I was loitering despite the fact that I had simply been sitting on my porch reading a book. Tara had gone so far as to accuse me of staring at children, which was not only a lie but an outright defamation of my character. "I wasn't stalking anyone," I said firmly. "I wasn't harassing anyone. I was just living my life on my own property." But Tara didn't see it that way. She was looking for a reason to tear me down. The room was still again, but this time the silence felt heavy with realization. The board members could no longer deny the truth. Tara had used the HOA to carry out her personal vendetta, and now the evidence was in their hands. And it doesn't stop there. I continued holding up the final page, a public court record. Tara had been the one who had manipulated the system to file false reports against me, to escalate minor disputes into legal issues. This court record shows how she took her vendetta so far that she involved the local authorities in her personal war. It wasn't just about parking tickets. It was about ruining my life. I could see Tara's eyes flicker with fear now. She had tried to control the narrative, to paint herself as the protector of the neighborhood, but her lies were laid bare in front of everyone. "I don't know how long you all have been turning a blind eye," I said, my voice rising with conviction. "But now you see it. You see what Tara has done, and you see how she's been using her position to manipulate every one of us. It's time for her to face the music." Tara's face twisted in rage. Her composure was gone. She could no longer hide behind her facade of authority. The truth was out, and it was undeniable. The board members began to murmur among themselves, their once unwavering loyalty to Tara now gone. They knew it. They knew they couldn't ignore what was right in front of them. I looked around the room, my gaze settling on each of the board members. "You can either continue to stand by and let her destroy this community, or you can stand with us and hold her accountable." As I spoke those final words, the room fell into a deep silence. No one knew what would come next, but one thing was certain: Tara's time was up. The finality of the board's decision lingered in the air. Tara was gone, her reign of terror over the neighborhood ended, but the silence that followed was anything but peaceful. The weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a heavy fog. As the neighbors slowly filtered out of the meeting, I could see a change in their demeanor. There was relief in their eyes, a collective breath held for too long finally exhaled. People who had once avoided eye contact with me now approached, shaking my hand, offering quiet words of gratitude. Linda, the woman who had once stayed silent, came over first. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, but filled with sincerity. "I've lived here for years, and I never thought anyone would stand up to Tara." I smiled, feeling the weight of the last few months finally lifting. The community was beginning to heal. The power Tara had held over the neighborhood for so long had crumbled, and with it the oppressive atmosphere that had once stifled everyone's voice. Others came forward too, neighbors who had stayed silent, fearful of retaliation. Now they felt emboldened. We weren't just fighting for me anymore, we were fighting for the entire community. A community that had been living in fear was now finding its voice again. A few days after the meeting, the consequences for Tara's actions started to unfold. Her removal from the HOA presidency was just the beginning. With the evidence I had presented, the board took immediate action to ensure that Tara would be held accountable for her abuse of power. The HOA issued a formal apology to the residents, acknowledging Tara's misconduct and the way she had manipulated the board and the community. The apology came in the form of a written letter sent to every resident, along with a promise that future board members would be more transparent, accountable, and held to higher standards. But that wasn't all. The legal ramifications for Tara's actions were far-reaching. The false reports, the baseless fines, and her interference with personal property rights had crossed the line into harassment and defamation. Tara was served with a lawsuit from several neighbors who had been victimized by her actions. A few weeks later, I received a call from my lawyer. Tara had been hit with multiple fines and was required to pay restitution to the people she had wronged. She had lost everything: her position, her power, and now her reputation. The legal process was long, and the legal battles would continue for a while. But Tara's arrogance and abuse had finally caught up with her. She couldn't manipulate the system anymore. The law was closing in on her, and she had no way out. Tara's downfall was swift, but it wasn't the end of the story. The neighborhood was finally free from the stranglehold she had kept on it for so long. As the weeks passed, the once stifled community began to flourish. The neighborhood was quieter, the tension that had once hung over it gone. People were smiling again, walking freely, without fear of being scrutinized or judged by the HOA. The final step of the healing process came when the new board, led by members who truly cared about the community, began to restore balance. They opened up the neighborhood's resources, allowing residents to make decisions together, holding open meetings and focusing on what was best for everyone, not just one person's agenda. As for me, the relief was overwhelming. I walked out of my house one evening, feeling the cool breeze and the warmth of the setting sun. I looked at the deck, which had once been the site of so many conflicts, and felt a sense of peace. It was no longer just a porch, it was a symbol of resilience, of standing up for what was right. I settled into my rocking chair, the one that had caused so much chaos just months before. I could finally relax, knowing that the power had shifted back into the hands of the people. I had reclaimed my peace, my property, and my dignity. As I sat there sipping my coffee, I heard the distant hum of neighborhood life returning to normal. People chatting, dogs barking, kids laughing, the sound of a community united once again. Some battles are won in silence, I thought to myself, as I leaned back in my chair and watched the sun dip below the horizon. The war was over, and I had won. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. It was the process that made all the difference. Initially, I was angry, frustrated, and just wanted to get even. But what really changed the outcome wasn't my anger, it was choosing to follow the legal process. When I stepped back and let the law take its course, it gave me clarity and focus. Without that, things could have easily gotten out of control. There's a fine line between standing up for your rights and letting emotions drive you to escalate a situation. It's tempting to act out of frustration, but evidence and legal procedures are the real tools that lead to lasting change, not rage. I could have easily fallen into a petty fight, but I didn't. I let the facts speak for themselves and trusted the system. If you're in a similar situation, start by keeping records. Don't rely on your memory. Check public filings and know when it's time to involve authorities or lawyers. Staying grounded in the facts will serve you much better than rushing into emotional confrontation. In the end, communities grow stronger when people respect the law. HOA power is only possible when it goes unchecked. But when we stand up and take the right actions, it makes all the difference. As I sat on my porch, it wasn't just a victory, it was the peace that comes from doing it the right way.